January 20, 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the youngest man ever elected President of the United States, stands on the Capitol platform. The air is cold and crisp, the sunlight is blinding, reflecting off the fresh snow. But the energy of the crowd is electric, filled with a sense of limitless possibility. The nation watches as Kennedy delivers his inaugural address, a masterpiece of rhetoric and idealism. He speaks of a new generation, a new frontier, and utters the immortal challenge that will define his presidency. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The applause that follows is deafening. America has a new hero, young, rich, and profoundly charismatic. Yet, amidst the assembled dignitaries, the political figures, and the representatives of the established order, there is a glaring, almost deliberate omission. A single figure is conspicuously absent from the platform where former presidents traditionally sit to lend their gravitas and continuity to the transfer of power. Harry S. Truman, the man who guided the nation through the conclusion of World War II, who decided to drop the atomic bomb, who set the architecture for the Cold War with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, is nowhere to be seen. Truman had left office just 8 years earlier, in 1953, and was still an active, outspoken, and perfectly healthy man of 76. He hadn't been forgotten, nor was he too frail to travel. He was not invited, and as his aides later confirmed, had an invitation been reluctantly extended, Truman would have refused it anyway. This wasn't an oversight. This was a direct, intentional act of political and personal hostility. John F. Kennedy and Harry Truman hated each other with a passion that transcended mere policy disagreement. Kennedy, the polished product of Harvard and inherited wealth, treated the only living former Democratic president, a titan of the 20th century, like a political enemy. For the first 2 years of the Camelot administration, Truman was effectively banned from the White House. This exclusion was not a result of a scheduling conflict or an accident of protocol. It was a deliberate signal. Kennedy wanted Truman to understand, clearly and unequivocally, that his time was over, that his judgment was irrelevant, and that he was unwelcome, unneeded, and obsolete. Today, we are going to dive deep into this seismic political feud. We will explore precisely why Kennedy took the extraordinary, unprecedented step of freezing out his predecessor, what Truman had done to earn such vindictive treatment, and how this deeply personal hatred revealed a generational and profound class war within the heart of the Democratic Party, a conflict whose echoes we can still hear in modern American politics. The seeds of this bitter animosity were sown during the feverish atmosphere of the 1960 presidential primary campaign. Kennedy was running for the Democratic nomination against formidable opponents like Lyndon B. Johnson and Hubert Humphrey. Kennedy was the undeniable frontrunner. Young, handsome, a decorated war hero, backed by a sophisticated, relentless political machine powered entirely by his father's immense fortune. Truman, a self-made man who had clawed his way to the top through the gritty reality of Missouri. Machine politics couldn't stand him. He viewed Kennedy as an entitled upstart, a politician who had simply bought his way past the queue of more experienced men. In July 1960, just days before the critical Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles, Truman chose his moment for maximum impact. He held a press conference that immediately dominated the national news cycle and dropped a political grenade. He announced with a stern glare and an air of righteous indignation that he would not be attending the convention. His reason? He claimed the process was irrevocably rigged for Kennedy. He stated flatly that the convention was controlled by Kennedy's notorious father, Joe Kennedy, who had, in Truman's exact words, spent a fortune to buy the nomination for his son. Truman didn't stop at accusations of financial manipulation. He launched a direct, devastating attack on Kennedy's personal and political maturity. He publicly questioned whether the young senator possessed the necessary wisdom and experience for the highest office in the land, asking pointedly, "Senator, are you certain you are quite ready for the country, or that the country is ready for you?" This public challenge was far more damaging than a typical political broadside. It came from Truman, the only living Democratic president, the party's elder statesman, the man who had faced down Stalin, rebuilt Europe, and dismissed the legendary General Douglas MacArthur. When Truman spoke, he did so with the immense, hard-won credibility of a true executive. He was, in essence, calling Kennedy dangerously unqualified, suggesting that a 43-year-old senator with a limited record of major legislative accomplishments and no significant executive experience was unprepared for the crushing weight of the presidency. For Kennedy's campaign, this was a political crisis. Why did Truman risk tearing the Democratic Party apart with such an attack? Several deep-seated reasons fueled his outrage. The first was a genuine belief in Kennedy's inexperience. Kennedy had been a senator for less than 8 years. He had never been a governor, never managed a large bureaucracy, and never been forced to make the kind of solitary, life-and-death executive decisions that Truman had faced daily. His primary qualifications, in Truman's eyes, were his wealth, his looks, and his articulate delivery. The second, and perhaps most passionate, reason was Truman's profound contempt for Joe Kennedy, JFK's powerful shadowy father. Joe Kennedy, having served as ambassador to Britain in the late 1930s, had infamously advocated for the appeasement of Adolf Hitler, stating publicly that Britain couldn't possibly win a war against Nazi Germany and that America should remain isolationist. To Truman, a veteran of World War I who deeply understood the menace of fascism, Joe Kennedy was a coward at best, and a dangerous sympathizer at worst. Furthermore, Joe Kennedy had amassed his vast fortune through questionable dealings, including possible bootlegging during Prohibition, and then shamelessly used that money to buy political influence for his family. Truman, who came from modest Missouri origins and built his career through decades of hard political struggle, resented wealthy men who believed power could be purchased like a commodity. Third, Truman's preferred candidate was Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson had been a powerful and ruthlessly effective Senate Majority Leader, boasting a long list of legislative accomplishments and executive-style management of the Senate itself. Truman felt Johnson was demonstrably more qualified and was frustrated that Kennedy's youth, glamour, and money were winning out over Johnson's substance and skill. Finally, there was the complex and ever-present Catholic issue. Kennedy was Catholic, and no Catholic had ever successfully overcome that prejudice in a presidential election. While Truman was not personally anti-Catholic, he was profoundly worried that nominating Kennedy was a reckless, unnecessary gamble that would cost the Democrats the White House, thus sacrificing the continuation of the party's hard-won power. Kennedy's response to Truman's blistering attack was a masterstroke of political composure and strategy. He did not become defensive or angry. Instead, he held his own televised press conference and released a telegram he claimed to have sent to Truman, containing a series of pointed, unanswerable questions. The core of his defense was a powerful rebuttal of the experience argument. May I ask you if you think 43 is too young for a president? It was you who appointed me to an international responsibility in 1945. When I was 28, I served in the Congress for 14 years, the same period you served before you became president. This maneuver was brilliant. Kennedy was publicly reminding the nation that Truman himself had been considered highly inexperienced. When he unexpectedly ascended to the presidency in 1945, Truman had served only 10 years in the Senate before becoming vice president, comparable record to Kennedy's. If Truman was qualified to lead the free world at 60, Kennedy asked implicitly, why was he not qualified at 43? Kennedy successfully positioned himself as the outsider, the vigorous young fighter, battling the cynical establishment, with Truman himself now appearing to be a part of that entrenched power base trying to block him. The public reaction overwhelmingly favored Kennedy. Truman, for the first time in his public life, looked like a bitter, jealous old man trying to protect his cronies. Kennedy won the nomination handily at the convention, while Truman eventually offered a grudging endorsement for the general election, only because Kennedy was running against Richard Nixon, whom Truman despised even more than Kennedy. The damage was done. Truman made it crystal clear he was supporting the party, not the man. Kennedy won the presidency in November 1960 in one of the tightest elections in American history, and he neither forgot nor forgave Truman's attempt to utterly destroy his campaign. The inauguration snub was merely the opening salvo. Traditionally, former presidents are honored guests at the White House. They receive invitations to state dinners, ceremonial occasions, and important policy announcements. This practice is essential for showing respect for the office and maintaining the symbolic continuity of the government. Kennedy invited none of them, except for Herbert Hoover, the Republican ex-president, who was elderly, apolitical, and harmless by then. But Truman, the only living Democratic ex-president, received nothing. No state dinners, no cultural events, no policy briefings. For 2 full years, Truman was effectively persona non grata. This was an act of profound pettiness, meticulously executed. The Kennedy White House was famous for its glamorous events, its glittering gatherings of artists, intellectuals, and celebrities. They made the White House the nexus of American culture and high society, and they ensured that Harry Truman the humble man from Independence, Missouri, knew he was definitively not part of it. Why was Kennedy so vindictive? Because Truman had struck at the very moment of Kennedy's greatest vulnerability, attempting to humiliate him on a global stage. Kennedy had spent years calculating every move, building alliances and raising money for this ascent. Then Truman, speaking with the moral authority of a former commander-in-chief, publicly labeled him an unqualified, rich kid whose father had purchased his nomination. Polling data confirmed that Truman's attack had hurt. Significant numbers of Democrats questioned Kennedy's experience after the press conference. Kennedy won despite the attack, but he believed in the necessity of getting even. There was also the deep, unbridgeable class dimension to their hatred. Kennedy was born into unparalleled wealth, attended the most elite schools, and moved in sophisticated social circles. His wife, Jackie, was the epitome of cultured elegance. Educated at the Sorbonne, fluent in French, the Kennedys represented American aristocracy, style, and sophistication. Truman was the absolute opposite. He had grown up on a Missouri farm, never graduated from college, failed as a haberdasher, and entered politics via the notoriously corrupt Pendergast machine. His wife, Bess, was solid, practical, and utterly uninterested in Washington's high society games. The Trumans represented pragmatic, working-class, middle America. Kennedy looked down on Truman as provincial and unsophisticated. Truman resented Kennedy as spoiled and entitled. They were, quite simply, two men who embodied what the other despised most about American society. The freeze continued throughout 1961 and 1962. Truman would read in the newspapers about the dazzling White House events he wasn't invited to. He saw photos of Kennedy with other former officials, knowing he was being deliberately excluded. This was intensely humiliating for a man who had shaped the post-war world. Truman did not suffer silently. He gave interviews criticizing Kennedy's policies. He publicly questioned Kennedy's handling of the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, suggesting that a more experienced president never would have approved such a poorly planned operation. He criticized Kennedy's cautious approach to civil rights legislation. He insinuated that Kennedy was more concerned with style than with substance. These criticisms stung because they contained elements of uncomfortable truth. The Bay of Pigs was indeed a disaster, and Kennedy's initial civil rights record was tepid. But Truman's pronouncements also began to sound like sour grapes from a bitter, old man who couldn't accept that his era was over. Kennedy's staff, ever expert in public relations, ensured the media framed it exactly that way, leaking stories that Truman was merely jealous of Kennedy's immense popularity and glamour. Even the triumphant resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, which cemented Kennedy's reputation, changed nothing between the two men. Truman gave grudging public acknowledgement of Kennedy's decisive handling of the crisis, but he also noted, unhelpfully, that Kennedy's prior blunder at the Bay of Pigs had arguably created the conditions for the crisis in the first place. Still, no White House invitation was forthcoming. By early 1963, the ban on Truman was becoming a political liability and an embarrassment to Kennedy. The press had picked up on the story. Democratic senators, loyal to the old guard, quietly asked why the party's elder statesman was being frozen out. Even some of Kennedy's own advisors suggested it was time for a superficial reconciliation. Kennedy resisted. He refused to give Truman the satisfaction, or to allow a photo opportunity that would suggest he needed the old man's blessing. Kennedy had won the presidency despite Truman's opposition, and he wanted that fact to remain a permanent marker. But the political pressure eventually mounted too high. Kennedy needed party unity for the upcoming 1964 re-election campaign. A public, running feud with the only living Democratic ex-president was an unnecessary, damaging liability. The breakthrough came through intermediaries. Mutual friends in the party negotiated a delicate political compromise. Kennedy would publicly praise Truman's presidency and acknowledge his contributions to the New Deal and the Cold War architecture. In return, Truman would accept an invitation to a White House event celebrating Medicare, a policy both men strongly supported. This allowed the reconciliation to occur without either man appearing to fully capitulate. The event happened in the spring of 1963. Truman came to the White House for the first time since Kennedy's inauguration. The photographs of the handshake are infamous. Two great leaders, united only by necessity, making the best of an incredibly awkward situation. Kennedy offers his famous, charming public smile, but it lacks warmth. Truman looks stiff, uncomfortable, like he would rather be anywhere else. They exchanged polite, rehearsed words. Truman nodded stiffly. Then he left as quickly as he could. The official reconciliation had occurred, but the hatred remained. Why did Kennedy finally relent? Because keeping Truman banned was hurting Kennedy more than Truman. It made Kennedy look petty, vindictive, and arrogant. It suggested a profound weakness that Kennedy was so threatened by an old man's criticism that he had to exclude him entirely. Furthermore, Kennedy was looking ahead to his place in history. Kennedy didn't want to be remembered as a president who engaged in petty personal feuds. Reconciling with Truman, even superficially, served Kennedy's long-term historical interests. However, the reconciliation was purely cosmetic. Kennedy and Truman never developed a real relationship. Kennedy never sought Truman's counsel. When Kennedy faced difficult decisions, like those in Vietnam or over civil rights legislation, he didn't call Truman for advice. Truman's vast, hard-won wisdom about the workings of the presidency, about dealing with congressional deadlock, and about managing intelligence failures was lost to Kennedy due to their mutual animosity. The ultimate tragedy here is that the problems Kennedy faced, the Bay of Pigs disaster born from trusting flawed intelligence without critical executive questioning, the difficulties with Congress that came from high vision lacking legislative finesse, the challenges of managing the party's diverse coalition were precisely the challenges Truman had mastered. But Kennedy never asked, and Truman never offered. Their mutual hatred prevented Truman from being useful to the new president, and Kennedy's short presidency arguably suffered for it. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, Harry Truman was reportedly devastated, not because he personally liked the man, but because he respected the sacred office and understood the profound national tragedy. Truman attended the funeral and was impeccably gracious to the Kennedy family. Whatever his feelings about JFK personally, Truman believed the presidency deserved respect. Even after Kennedy's death, Truman offered a more generous assessment of his presidency, acknowledging his accomplishments, particularly on foreign policy. Yet until his death in 1972, Truman never fully conceded that Kennedy was experienced. He went to his grave believing Kennedy had been promoted too fast and that his youth had been a liability. The Kennedy family, for their part, never forgave Truman's 1960 attacks. When Lyndon Johnson became president, he immediately invited Truman back to the White House and consulted him frequently. But when Robert Kennedy ran for president in 1968, the Kennedys made it clear that Truman's support was not welcome. The Kennedys never forgot who their enemies were. The Truman-Kennedy feud reveals important and enduring truths about American politics. It shows how profoundly personal these conflicts are, how much ego and pride drive political leaders. Kennedy banned Truman not over policy, but because Truman had wounded his pride. It highlights the devastating generational conflict within the Democratic Party. Truman representing the pragmatic, working-class New Deal Democrats, and Kennedy representing the educated, sophisticated, internationalist, urban New Liberalism. Most critically, the feud demonstrates how destructive personal animosity can be. Truman had wisdom Kennedy desperately needed. Kennedy had the energy and vision that could have inspired Truman. Instead, they spent years insulting each other and refusing to cooperate. The 2-year ban on Truman was one of the pettiest, most counterproductive acts in presidential history. Truman shared the blame for launching the unnecessarily personal attacks in 1960, but Kennedy escalated the response to an institutional slight. In the end, the real legacy of Kennedy banning Truman from the White House wasn't just 2 years of exclusion. It was a symbolic break, a final announcement that the old ways, the old guard, and the old priorities were finished, and that a new generation, defined by charisma over continuity, had taken command. Harry Truman, a former president who had shaped the world's destiny, spent 2 years knowing he was not welcome in the House he once commanded, all because he had insulted a young senator's qualifications. Sometimes the most powerful people in the world are just as petty as everyone else. John F. Kennedy proved that by banning Harry Truman from the White House, and Truman proved it by launching the attack in the first place. 2 presidents dedicated to public service, who simply could not get past their mutual contempt, to work together for the greater good. That is not just a historical curiosity. It is a permanent warning about what happens when political ego matters more than national duty.